Right, I've got half an hour till I need to start tutoring, so let's get into this. Today's video is going to be my review of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte that I read for the Victober readathon this October. So like I said in my previous video on this, I went to go read this book a few times but couldn't get past the first few pages, so I thought this would be the greatest opportunity to get stuck in and really give it its fair time. It's my best go. But yeah, I knew that I wanted to read this book because I'd heard so many good things about it. But yeah, I'm going to do a quick explain of the story before I get into my thoughts on it. So this book is basically a letter between Gilbert Markham, a gentleman farmer, and his brother-in-law about why he was elusive about certain topics when they last met. It starts off in 1827 as Gilbert launches into this story of this mysterious new woman that's moved to their village and how everyone has something to say about her, but no one seems to know anything at the same time. Inevitably, Gilbert ends up falling in love with her, and she seems to have some feelings for him too, but she says that she can't love him, and so she gives him her old diary entries as a way of explaining her secret and explaining why she can't actually love him back. This then launches into the middle portion of the book, which is her diary entries that go all the way back to 1821, and she goes through all her decision making around who she's going to marry and why, and then ultimately showing how she ended up marrying her husband, Mr. Huntingdon. We see things get worse and worse for her/her family, and how having her child made her decide that it was no longer her husband's behaviour that she had to save, but her child. Her husband's misdemeanours get worse and worse, as do his friends, and eventually there's a big fallout, and eventually she begins to plan her own method of escape. Yeah, it does seem weird to give away that much of the plot, but it is essentially told to you on the blurb, and the final third of the book is what happens between her and Gilbert, and how is it all going to be resolved. And I definitely think that there is so much more to the book than that, so many interesting questions and thoughts and moral things that you definitely get more than you bargained for with this book. So originally I had 3 to 4 main thoughts on this book, but I lost half of my notes. But I'm going to mostly talk about the effect of behaviour, and then talk about religion and morality, and then a little bit on setting and nature and that sort of thing as well. My section on behaviour is probably my biggest part, so that's what I'm going to launch into first. So it would be quite easy to describe Helen's character as the sort of perfect, moral, holier-than-thou almost character that's always perfect and almost looking down on everyone. That's kind of what the villagers think, and I think some readers can also fall into the trap of thinking this. But I think Anne makes it quite clear that she is not the perfect character. Her husband's faults were out and obvious to the world, and everyone was pointing them out, but she chose to ignore them, and she thought that she could change them, which is tragic, and obviously she shouldn't be put down for that, but it also, she isn't perfect, she makes wrong decisions. But at the same time, she has these views and behaviour that she holds to, and although I'd want to avoid treating Helen like a perfect character, I did think it was really interesting the way that she brought out people's behaviour and really showed them how they were acting and the implications of that. Yeah, this is almost why she marries her husband. She thinks that that's what she's going to be able to do, and it's a big question as to whether she succeeded or failed at that in the long run with her husband, but I think she also succeeds with that with a lot of the characters in this book. The biggest part, I guess, is the villagers in and around Wildfell Hall, who all think she's over the top when actually she's quite justified in her behaviour in order to protect her son. With many of the people that she meets, she's often there around their worst behaviour, and she really finds the best moments to show that to them, to explain to them where that's leading and what that's doing to their relationships. I really hope you can't hear my washing machine, that would be really annoying. Washing machine, shut up! So the biggest example of her showing people's behaviour and pointing it out to them is with her husband's friends. You have Lord and Lady Lowborough, Mr. Hattersley and Mr. Grimsby. Quite symmetrically, you end up with 2 who end up reforming their ways and 2 who sort of sink deeper into their antics. One of the most heartwarming and satisfying reformations in this story is Mr. Hattersley, mostly because his wife is so lovely and sweet and quiet, but she just can't talk to him about these things that are upsetting her, And so eventually when Helen does explain to him that, look, this is the effect that it's having on your wife, can't you see? And then he sees and he realises and he changes his behaviour. Oh, it's the most lovely thing. I think it's one of my favourite moments, really. One of the more negative elements of behaviour in this book was actually to do with the narrator, with Gilbert Markham. I wasn't sure whether Gilbert actually truly saw and acknowledged his own bad behaviour. He's kind of admitting it in a letter to his friend, so it kind of suggests that he has. But yeah, at many points throughout the novel, Gilbert describes people and says how they're so provoking. He finds them provocative by the little things that they do. Even one time when Helen just looks away from him at church and he's like, oh, so provocative, makes me so angry. And he often describes his own mood and temper as stormy. At first he kind of hates Helen until he starts adoring her, and he's constantly annoyed at things. And I think the most shocking of these moments is when, you know, there's gossip going around the village about Helen and he thinks that this one guy's connected, and so he literally strikes him off his horse with a whip and like pretty much leaves him for dead, and this guy is ill for weeks afterwards. Of course, once Gilbert actually understands what's gone on, he apologises to this man. But the bit that made me uncomfortable is that they agree to keep it a secret from Helen. Surely after everything she's been through and everything that she's told him and confessed him, all these private literal diary entries. Great, now my washing machine's singing. Surely after all of this and everything that she's confessed to him, surely she deserves to have a bit of honesty from him about the fact that, you know, he struck this guy off his horse and was the reason he was wrapped up ill in bed for literal weeks. So I wasn't entirely happy with this, but at the same time I'm not really sure what to think, because I know that Anne Bronte wouldn't really want to have a perfect cast of characters, even the narrator, not even the main character, so why would I expect Gilbert to be perfect? But I kind of wanted him to be a bit better regarding that. But yeah, the second thing that I really enjoyed about this book was the discussions around morality and religion. We have these epic debates, almost where the villagers discuss whether she's being over the top in how she's protecting her son. And one of the vivid images that they use is both sides use this image of trees. One side uses the image where, you know, the trees on the moors are stronger because of the exposure that they face. But then on the other hand, fruit trees that are grown in greenhouses are more fruitful because of the protection that they have. And it brings in questions, you know, around gender and, you know, why the fruit tree aspect is more accepted for women, but the rugged tree out on the moors is more acceptable for men. Surely exposure or not exposure for people should be the same morally. And so there were massive questions about how to stop a child from copying the bad behaviour that they see. And Helen's convictions came through so strongly and so eloquently. I was literally in awe at how confidently she spoke them. The really interesting aspects that I really enjoyed reading about was religion and what heaven will be like, especially for spouses. Will you really value the things that you valued here on earth when you've got all the gloriousness of heaven around you? What will happen to spouses? And a really interesting part of that was when Helen and her husband were talking about the parable of Lazarus, how the rich man who ignored all the warnings and was just horrible ended up in hell, and Lazarus, the poor man who sort of had faith, got all the comforts in heaven, and how Lazarus wanted Lazarus to help him out of hell, but there was a massive chasm between them. There was, you know, no connection there. But I thought it applied really well to Mr. Huntingdon and his friends, because if you put like Mr. Huntingdon as Lazarus, how when he realises, you know, what's wrong with everything, you know, he would almost want to tell his friends and to get his friends to realise so that they don't get the same. But when the same message is open for everyone, you either take it or leave it. You know, what good is it once you've died? And yeah, questions around like when is too late to, you know, repent of your sins. But yeah, I found it actually quite fascinating because, as I said, she believed in universal salvation, that everyone ends up in heaven in the end. And I'd never really thought about the practicalities of how that idea would work out. It's a different school of thought to, you know, what I'm used to reading. And so, yeah, the practicalities of that, of how sin and hell apply and are still relevant even with the universalist point of view. I found that really fascinating when you think about how her and her husband are ultimately going in different directions, and whether they will, you know, meet up again or whether that's the end. I found it really interesting. And the way that she spoke to her husband about these things was so heartfelt, despite everything that he'd done. I found it so lovely. But also another interesting bit that I wanted to tack on the end of this idea was that how when Gilbert realises how different their classes actually are, to him that class difference becomes as much of a separation as death, as the chasm between Lazarus and the rich man. It was a small touch, but again, it was just a really fascinating, interesting addition. So I had another section on nature and setting and how that comes into play in the story. This section was the one that took the biggest chunk when I accidentally lost my notes, so I'll try my best. But yeah, it was more to do with the natural environment and anonymity and belonging. But yeah, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully I'll be back again soon with another video, but until then, bye!